Hi everyone, I'm Beverley Wang. I'll be moderating the session today with the writers Ta-Nehisi, Sisonke, Msimang, and the Professor of Constitutional Law, Megan Davis. Welcome everybody. Great to see a full house for this very heavyweight panel that we have gathered before us. And we have been asked to talk about race, power, and privilege with a strong emphasis on history, and we will reserve time for questions before the session ends. Sisonke Msimang is a South African who writes about race, democracy, and justice. She divides her time between Perth and Johannesburg, and she is the author of Always Another Country, her memoir. Megan Davis is a cobble woman from Queensland, an expert member of the United Nations Human Rights Council's expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people, and a member of both the Referendum Council and the expert panel on recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples in the Constitution. And Ta-Nehisi, I know you don't like bios or introductions, so I'll just say that you are a writer. All right. So just to kick things off, I'd love for each of you to share on the subjects of race, power, and privilege. What are the persistent questions that keep you up at night? Megan, since you're closest, go for it.
Well, obviously, from a domestic perspective anyway, I've been involved with the constitutional recognition process for about 8 years, but for the bulk of my academic career. The big questions, I suppose, that keep me up at night on race and is I guess, how we are able to get structural reform in this country for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, some form of substantive recognition, in the absence of any real understanding in Australia of Aboriginal history. And so, the exigency of reform is inextricably linked to Australian history, and unless you're a student of Australian history, it's very difficult to understand why people might be making claims for substantive rights, not to be recognised in a symbolic way in the Constitution, meaning some sort of adornment or plaque in the Constitution that says these people were here, we killed most of them, but they're still here. That keeps me awake.
Yeah.
What are we going to do to push this forward so that we can actually begin the process of reconciliation, because we're not in it at all. Mm-hmm. And how we start the process of settlement.
And you say that we're not in this process at all, despite the many years that you spent working in it. You feel like it hasn't.
No, but I think that there's lots of reasons for that, including the very kind of contrived way in which the reconciliation process was set up in the first place. Mm-hmm. It was set up because Prime Minister Hawke couldn't deliver on land rights or a treaty, so he passed a statute legislating a reconciliation process. That went on for 10 years, and then at the other end, all of the proposals were rejected. Today, reconciliation is just about reconciliation action plans. Mm-hmm. They're about job covenants with corporate Australia. Australia has wholly skipped the truth and justice part of reconciliation, and Australia thinks it can just move to reconciliation, but it can't. And it can't because we're not even at the starting gate, I think. There's been some forms of truth-telling through bringing them home and the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, but we're really not at the gate yet.
So that's the conundrum for you. How about you, Ta-Nehisi?
I mean, I guess to be blunt, whether white supremacy will destroy the world or not. Mm-hmm. That sounds very high-minded and abstract, but I'm from a country that was founded on white supremacy. It would not exist without it, as is true here in Australia, the destruction of the native inhabitants and the purchase, enslavement, and exploitation of large numbers of Africans brought over. This was an enormous sense of wealth in America. In 1860, when we had our Civil War, this represented somewhere on the order of something around $75 billion in wealth in today's dollars. 60% of our exports in 1860 were derived from cotton. The 4 million enslaved Africans were the largest source of wealth, the largest asset in America, period, but also greater than all the other sources of assets put together. So tremendous amount of wealth. We had a cataclysmic war, and that wealth was effectively liquidated, if it's fair to talk about human beings in that way. And the country never quite recovered from that. White people in America have never quite recovered from that. They haven't recovered from Martin Luther King. They certainly have not recovered from Barack Obama, such to the extent that we have elected, for the first time in American history, a president who has not only no military experience, no governing experience, someone who, I joked about this the other night, if he were black, couldn't even get off the street, much less into the White House. This is who has access to the nuclear codes right now. And the reason why he has access, and the way he got access, was through the forces of white supremacy. Maligning the previous president as not being a legitimate American citizen, which is a very, very old tactic in America. Making war against Latinos and immigrants from South America right now, making war against Muslims and Arab Americans right now, and not coincidentally, making war, I would argue, against women in America. This goes back to our history of white supremacy, and it is no longer merely a threat to black people in America, it's a threat to the entire world. This is a man who's conducting nuclear policy or nuclear negotiations via Twitter. And the road to that is white supremacy. So when I say, that's what keeps me up at night, I am not being bombastic. It's literally true.
Sisonke, how about you?
So lately, what's been keeping me up at night is these sort of egregious claims about white genocide in South Africa. Because I think they do reflect many of the forces that both Ta-Nehisi and Megan have spoken about, which is this sort of enduring idea about how important white people are in this world. So fundamentally important, more important than anything else. And so I think we have this, we have an incredible professor in South Africa, his name is Njabulo Ndebele, and he writes about the protections, the international protections of whiteness. And so what happens with South Africa is it's the last outpost of white supremacy, right? It's the last place, this place in Africa where white people live, surrounded by black people. And so in some ways, what happens to white South Africans, white people in many parts of the world feel like they care about, right? So that's why we've got Trump tweeting about this supposed white genocide, which is a figment of many people's imagination, but also kind of, for me, it's profoundly insulting because of the grace that black people in South Africa showed to white people at the end of apartheid. So to have been effectively, to have been victims of a crime against humanity, the United Nations declared that apartheid represented a crime against humanity, right? And so for black people to have emerged out of that in 1994 with this extraordinary commitment to truth-telling, with no request for justice, honestly, if we are honest about it. The world loves Nelson Mandela for many reasons, but one of the things that happened is that Mandela negotiated for us a settlement which didn't lead to justice. It led to this fuzzy notion of reconciliation. And part of the process of truth-telling was that if you tell us the truth, white people, about where the bodies lay, about where the victims were, about who you killed, if you tell us the truth, we will live with you as if nothing ever happened. And so for South Africans to have done that, for black people to have had that grace to do that, and to really do it for 26 years, and then for white farmers who represent a small minority of the population, and own 70% of the land, and who are victims of crime to the same extent as every black person in our country is a victim of crime, which is a consequence of a violent history, for them to turn around and say they are victims of genocide, that word is insulting. And so that is what keeps me awake at night.
Thinking about the founding of these countries, but in particular, I guess, the Australian and American contexts, right? There's the history of the founding, and then there's the mythology that gets wrapped around it. And I think about the United States, and I think about Australia, and I think about the slogans that accompany both of these countries: land of the free, land of the fair go, the American way, the Australian way. But clearly these slogans don't sit well with you if you think about, I suppose, the unresolved and open wounds of history that you must spend a lot of time thinking about. So just talk us through a little bit about how you grapple with this intertwining of the Black history and the white history in the same country, and how they, I guess we have these myths about meritocracy and success, and if you work hard enough, anything's possible, but there are structures that impede that success, aren't there?
Yeah. So,
go for it.
the disadvantage we experience today is very much about structural disadvantage and structural oppression. When you look, I suppose, to the very early British arrival, for example, and we saw the Daily Telegraph, I think, a year ago or 2 years ago, at the mention of, I think it was actually in a UNSW document about the use of the word invasion, and it became a front, cover story the next day with Captain Cook on the front, and I mean, it's been many years since Mabo. You'd be like, I was a bit surprised that was even the question, that it was even questioned. Mm-hmm. But part of what we're doing in terms of broader constitutional recognition is to wheel it all back to that really fundamental question. That period of empire where the arrivals in Australia were very much about the territory, dispossessing Aboriginal people of the land. Following that, you had a very lengthy period of killings and massacres that really only today we're starting to talk about. But certainly over 10 years working constitutional reform, you see that history, butt up against the mythologies, as you allude to, in Australia about Australia's settlement. At Uluru, we decided, as First Nations, to from now on call it an invasion. There is no question about that. We never consented. We never ceded. The British never asked permission. The question of sovereignty is unresolved in this country, and it is the big elephant in the room, and it's the question that the state and many Australian people don't want to talk about. And partly because what does justice look like? If you talk about the truth and you talk about what happened in terms of what was, many people refer to it as extermination. When the protection era, the benignly known, Australians love calling it the protection era, the benignly labelled protection era, which was really after the bulk of people had been massacred, they moved them off the lands into reserves and missions. Because it was easier then to establish the pastoral industries and push forward into other parts. The political economy of Australia's settlement is killing, is massacre, and that's a conversation that we have to have. But then at Australia Day and leading up to Australia Day, it's becoming so toxic, so intense every year. We have to sit through these stories about, the settlement of Australia and stories of Captain Cook and Arthur Phillip. And it's, a lot of black fellas like me stay at home. It's nauseating. The power of social media has meant that there's been some traction in terms of Aboriginal people being able to contest these mythologies and provide that space for Australians to think twice about what they've been taught at school and what they think about the Australian state. But really, the huge battle that we're having in relation to any form of meaningful Aboriginal recognition, and recognition can mean something as small as a statement of recognition. In the Constitution, it might mean treaties or, regional autonomy. It can mean many things. But one of the biggest hurdles that we have is these stories that Australians tell about themselves.
Ta-Nehisi, these stories are so powerful, aren't they? I mean, how do you even begin to push back on this idea that America is the land of the free and the brave? I mean, that's foundational learning and internalization.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, let me back up. One of the problems America has is, and this is partial to this idea of being this land of the free, is, this sort of font of democracy. Which is true. The problem is that it's only half true. American democracy was literally made possible by enslavement. You could not have one without the other. In America, it's often said that slavery was the great birth defect of this country, as though America is mostly right and did this one wrong thing. But in fact, the one wrong thing is the entirety of the thing. It's how it was done. It's the actual methodology of it. If you went to a state such as Mississippi, which is in the southern United States, or Alabama, which is in the southern United States, Louisiana, in the era just before the Civil War, before emancipation of black people, most of the people living in these states were in fact black. Most of the people living in those states were in fact enslaved. They were exploited, and labor was literally taken out of their bodies. The wealth of it didn't just make for stability for the white population, it offered a sense of identity, a kind of civic virtue. Who am I? I'm a free, land-holding white man who is not enslaved. Therefore, I have the right to speak, I have the right to be part of the democracy, I have a right to be part of the people. And these myths haunt us even to this very day. It's the reason why at this late hour, there are people in the United States trying to strip black people of voting rights. There are people, in the state of Texas, who are trying to revoke citizenship and passports, from Latino and Hispanic Americans at this very, very late date. We have not been able to extract this fake notion, and I think it's really, really important to say this invented notion of whiteness from the idea of citizenship. And it's a huge problem. I mean, again, I hate to go back to this, but I have to repeat. The greeting that the first black president of the United States of America got was that half, at different points to the majority of the opposition party, did not believe he was a citizen of the United States. That is incredible. That means they basically did not accept him as a legitimate president. Despite all evidence, despite all facts, the man went on TV, produced his birth certificate. And not only that, went and then elected the guy who was the chief person saying he wasn't a citizen to be president. That's how powerful the myth is. And more dangerous than that is the fact that I would argue, the president himself, Barack Obama himself, and many of us who would be considered good-hearted, people, have not accepted how powerful the myth is. We want to think that the critical mass of America is good, is just, will ultimately do the right thing, is not motivated by greed, avarice, is not motivated by the desire of plunder, but in fact, our record shows something very, very different. And we haven't
Barack
accepted
Obama
that yet.
forwarded that myth as a fundamental
Very much
belief
so.
in the goodness of the American people. But Sisonke, I see you nodding down there, and I want you to come in and tell us what you think.
It's hard not to nod with this panel. Look, I think for me, this, for us in South Africa, this question of the land is the place where the myths begin, and it's very similar to Australia, because the idea of terra nullius is foundational, that what happened is white people came to this empty land. And in South Africa, it's quite a trip, because in 1652, this guy called Jan van Riebeeck is sent by the Dutch East India Company to set up a trading post. So they say to him in Amsterdam, they say, we're not colonizing this place. We're just putting up a little trading post because there's all these ships going around the Cape of Good Hope. And so what we're going to do is you're going to have a few farms and make some produce and have a few cows so that there can be fresh provisions for the boats, right? So it's the entire thing is crazy. But the premise is, when you get there have to be people there, right? Because who's going to grow the produce? How's this going to work, right? Because the boat does not have a lot of people on it. So they get there, they find unwilling natives who are not prepared. They had things to do, right? People were busy, right? People were doing stuff. People were busy. So when they came to them with this idea that you guys are going to help us to farm this thing. They were like, no, we don't need to do that. We're not interested in doing that. We have our own lives. You can be over there, right? Because they didn't understand yet. And that's when the guns come out, right? And that's when then this recreation, this rewriting, this mythology that the place was largely empty, which it wasn't. That, in fact, we know Xhosa Nation has many, many people in it. By that time, Xhosa people were living in encampments of 50, 60,000 people, right? In one encampment, in one area. This is a rich trading zone, right? There's a lot of people there. And if you look at the archive, if you look at the colonial archive and what they're saying about their encounters at that time, we have the reality, which is that Europeans are encountering large groups of Africans, and as they encounter them, they're scared of their numbers. So they're talking about the fact that there's so few of them in relation to the many black people, the hordes. They refer to them as hordes. And yet somehow there's this enduring mythology that what they found was an empty land, right? So it's not just a myth. I think what's really important to think about when we talk about this foundational stuff, whether it's America, whether it's Australia, whether it's South Africa, is that it's not just a myth, it is a deliberate act. There are decisions, because myth makes it sound like it kind of evolved over time, accidentally. Like somehow we arrived at this place where people think that that believe in American exceptionalism. No, there's a very clear way in which these ideas have been constructed because they suit particular interests. Mm-hmm. And in the case of South Africa, it's propaganda. That's the word. It's propaganda. Mm-hmm. Because what interest does it serve to talk about the land being empty? Mm-hmm. The interest is that you can then take over that land. Mm-hmm. You can own that land. And then we can now have a debate about the legitimacy of people who stole land and say it's really their land. And this crops up time and time again, even to this day in 2018, with all the evidence that we have, that all the places where black people were, where they were living, it crops up time and again. This land has been in our family for generations. It was empty when we got here. So these myths exist for a reason, and so it's not simply a matter of educating people to know different. Because if it was about education, then all the data that we produce, all the arguments that we make would be convincing, and then the myths would disappear. So they exist because they hold up the societies in which we live. They hold up whiteness, they hold up patriarchy, they hold up all these things, and they benefit certain people.
Let's talk a little bit about the idea of reparations, recognition, land reform, all the different terms that we can use to discuss trying to right these wrongs of the past. Megan, in Australia, as we well know, the statement from Uluru, which pushed for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament for Aboriginal people, was rejected out of hand. When you encounter that kind of rejection, how do you regroup and think, well, okay, what do we do now? How do we try again? This idea of having to persist against this very, very strong rejection is one that I'm very curious to get your view on.
Well, obviously the Uluru Statement from the Heart, we took a different approach to previous pushes for reform in that we issued it to the Australian people because and as we all know from the past couple of weeks, we made a decision at Uluru that the Parliament is not going to be able to do this.
Why not? I don't understand.
Good call.
Seems fine.
That we were going to need help to convince politicians because they're ultra-conservative political elite. And these days they're just not interested at all in Aboriginal issues and certainly not in addressing unfinished business between First Peoples and the Australian state. So we deliberately, we uninvited the Prime Minister and Opposition Leader, caused a minor diplomatic incident, and decided, look, we're going to present this statement to Australians because they're the ones that have to help us achieve these reforms. Because, we go to these festivals, we talk about this stuff all the time and everybody nods in agreement. But when the time comes to get some help to push these reforms,
nobody's there.
Everyone's like,
I thought we were going to fix it today in this room in the 33 minutes that we had left. I don't know.
Or it's I'm going to sit here and nod, but really the only way you're going to get this up is for the blacks to be unified. I mean, that's the thing that we're struggling with now.
Absolutely.
Every Aboriginal person has to be unified.
That's right.
There can be no tension, there can be no disagreement.
Because white people all disagree with each other.
Yes, exactly. But I'll just park that for a moment.
Okay.
So we knew the Parliament is incapable of doing this. So after Uluru, it was said to us, just leave it to the Parliament now. And we were like, you can't. These people are incapable of reform. But we do in multiple areas in Australia. We live in a reform inert era. They are incapable, whether it's climate change or productivity, or they are incapable of reform, or vision for that matter. So one of the things that did happen after Uluru was there was the rejection, but not much later, Turnbull put the voice, the Uluru outcomes, into the terms of reference for a parliamentary joint select committee. And that was done because many Australians have stepped up to the plate and supported us in that reform. We've heard it came up in micro-polling, that it came up in electoral offices where people were like, that seemed like a pretty fair reform. Why have you just rejected it without discussing it with us or debating with us? So, in fact, the Joint Select Committee's interim report came out 3 weeks ago, and the bulk of its work for the rest of the year is what does this voice look like and how are we going to get it to a referendum?
So are you encouraged by that?
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I mean, these things never come easily.
Yep.
But in terms of just the tail end of your question around reparations and compensation, these are the big questions we really haven't had conversations about in Australia. And you heard for many years, for 8 years, don't raise reparations, don't raise money, don't raise compensation, don't alarm the white people, because they won't support it. And I've no doubt that's behind the political elite's preference for symbolism, for a token gesture of recognition. But at the end of the day, if the voice is set up and the voice is functioning, and Australians get used to First Nations, so nations being the voice of their communities, not the special envoy, then eventually we will see the creation of this commission, this agreement-making commission, that involves truth-telling, but will involve necessarily conversations with Australians about what it looks like, about what reparations look like.
Ta-Nehisi, when you come to Australia and you hear someone like Megan describing the obstacles that Aboriginal people face in getting recognition and getting dialogue, what do you think?
I think y'all are ahead of us.
Really?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a lot that's familiar. For instance, the don't raise it, but it's seen as so far beyond the pale. And what is deeply sad is reparations is not, for my money, one way forward. It's actually the only way forward. We have a very, very simple problem in America. There is roughly a 20-to-1 wealth gap. That means for every nickel a black family has, your average white family has roughly $1. This did not appear by myth.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, just in the case for reparations, you write about how John Conyers, a longtime congressman, now resigned because of sexual harassment allegations.
Yes.
He had a bill where where he was proposing continuously studying reparations. Where's the future of something like that?
I mean, we can't even get a study. And we probably will not get a study. The deep problem with reparations in America, I think, goes back to your last question. It's not the money. It's not getting the money to or the wealth transfer. It's the fact that reparations deeply undercuts the myth of America itself. Again, as you asked, this question of this country, land of the free. Original font of democracy. What does it mean? Not just to confess that you are, in fact, built on slavery. Everything about you was made possible through slavery, that you have no culture without slavery. You can't imagine America without Aretha Franklin. You can't imagine America without Louis Armstrong, without hip-hop. You can't imagine American cuisine without black people cooking in the kitchens. America is literally unimaginable across the board, culturally, economically, politically, everything. Our greatest, our most popular novel, Gone with the Wind, it's a white supremacist novel. Our first great movie, Birth of a Nation, is a white supremacist movie. It is at the core of the country. And if you give reparations, you necessarily admit this. And this goes against all of the mythology, and it has great repercussions, not just for black people in America, but for instance, when America wants to wage war in another country and wants to talk about, expanding the rights of the free, how can it do that when it's just admitted that, in fact, we were founded on slavery? So it's a question of morality, it's a question of founding myth, and so to give reparations to black people would require a profoundly different America. It would have to think about itself. It could no longer be a place that imagines itself as above the human experience, a republic of gods.
It would be shattering. Wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it would be humbling.
Yeah.
It would be very, very humbling.
Sisonke, what about in South Africa? I mean, land reform is a live conversation at the moment.
I mean, South Africa is interesting because we're the majority, right? Black people are the majority. It's our government. We elect a majority black government. We've done so for the last 25 years. Of course, the wealth remains in the hands of the white minority, but we have political power, and that has some meaning. But we hedge around managing white anxiety, both within South Africa, but because of the connection between the protections of international whiteness that I spoke about earlier, what happens is white anxiety within South Africa spreads to the global markets, right? So from the very beginning, the South African negotiated settlement was about managing white people's anxiety about what they would lose when apartheid ended. One of the things they were worried about losing was the political power, but the thing that they were really worried about losing was economic power, was their way of life, their privileges. And that hasn't happened, right? Because we extended ourselves, forgave them. But what we really did, more than forgive them, is that we made the truth and reconciliation process, and this will be interesting for Australians, we made the truth and reconciliation process very narrow. So the reason why apartheid was a crime against humanity is because it was a crime against every single black person who lived in the country. It was an affront against us, right? You couldn't drink at the water fountains, you couldn't live in this area, you were issued a passport for a fake country. We talk about fake news now. South Africa created fake countries, these Bantustans that were not real, figments of the apartheid imagination to say black people belong in tribes that black people had not lived in or belonged to for many years, right? So because of the way that apartheid affected every single black person, it was a crime against black people, it was a crime against humanity. In the TRC process, what we did was we defined crimes as families that had specific human rights violations against them. So what it meant was the hearings and the national process was about forgiveness if someone had been murdered by the police, if someone had been executed, if there was a death or a body or an abduction, which is a much narrower set of people than every single black person who was affronted by the crime of apartheid and who suffered economically as a consequence of apartheid, right? Because there was job reservation, et cetera. So what it's meant is that we negotiated our way into white people's privilege being upheld at the expense of the vast majority of black people, because we never put into the TRC process what we should have, which was, how do we make reparations, how do we calculate the cost of black people continuing to live very far from the economic center? That's what keeps black people in South Africa poor today, right? That you have to spend 60% of your salary every month just in taking transport into the city, because black people were deliberately moved far away so white people didn't have to look at them, right? So these are the inequalities that are entrenched, that are economic, that are a consequence of apartheid, which we never dealt with because TRC, we focused it narrowly on the trauma of your body being beaten, but we were not interested in opening it up too wide because we didn't want the international community, white capital, to be nervous about what that would really mean. If we did proper reparations in South Africa, it would have been a very different, it would look like a different country. And so that's what we deliberately excluded from the frame. And this is the problem with reparations in South Africa. So it's a black government, we have political power, but we remain very much hostage to international sentiment, the sentiment of the markets, right? The market guy is so moody, right? And he has the market guy has a particular view on black governments and the capacity of black people to manage money, the wealth of white people in a country like South Africa.
Well, I mean, we were talking about this off stage about the truth-telling component that fell out of Uluru, and that, in fact, the conversations in the Aboriginal dialogues in the 13 regions was about a very localised form of truth-telling that they would do in their region for their nation, their Aboriginal nation. But since that some of those conversations have been hijacked by political elites and black elites who are calling for royal commission. Everything in Aboriginal Australia gets parked in royal commissions these days. They're no longer used as an effective law reform tool, but as a kicking the can exercise. But that's certainly not what was envisaged in the dialogues. Was to have a big, Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa, but that really, I think, feeds into a really key issue here about people failing to hear what it is that people are saying and what it is that they want. There's an American scholar called Jill Stauffer that writes about ethical loneliness and how this failure to hear what people are trying to say haunts sites of reconciliation, and I think that's very much what's happening in Australia. And I really hope, in terms of the structural aspect of what truth-telling will look like, that it doesn't get hijacked by those people who think they know best, but that it is done in a way that is communities feel like they have control over and that they feel comfortable with. And we were saying some of the heavy lifting of reconciliation in Australia is done at a local level. It's done at very local levels with local communities, local historians, local councils. Local councils actually are really the unspoken, I wouldn't call them heroes, but of the reconciliation movement. They do a lot of heavy lifting. I just think it's...
Yeah.
We need to be really
We were talking about how Australia can do differently. So I'm not an opponent of truth commissions. I think they can be powerful. And despite my critiques of what happened in South Africa, I think they were investigations that were important for families, so that we knew where people were. So that aspect of it, people like to forget, and they focus on the fluffy reconciliation, loving white people. But actually the TRC was very much, some of it was really about finding bodies, and that was important. And I think to the extent that in Australia, truth commissions are important, they're about very local processes where people actually live, where apologies and recognitions of massacres really matter. It's there. It's not this thing that's easily hijacked that exists sort of at this umbrella level that is too... It's dodgy.
It's interesting because I was saying to Beverley, there's one thing that really resonated through the constitutional reform process, and I used to follow, your tweets and some of your writings about people's responses to your book, and people would say in book reviews, "Where's the hope? You're too pessimistic. Give me some hope." And that really has informed a lot of our thinking around this, because that's what we get a lot from people. Post Uluru, we got a lot of. The truth-telling will tell the good things too, won't it? It'll tell the coexistence stories, and it'll tell the... you have to give white Australia hope. And just really, mirrored for me some of the things that you were saying about people's reactions to what you were writing.
We will open up the floor to questions from the audience. There are microphones on the side. If I could please ask that you we have a full house, so if we can keep your questions and keep your questions brief. Thank you very much. I guess while there's already a couple of people. Okay, so should we start here?
Sorry. Okay. So, hi. This question is for Mr. Coates. I would like to understand your thoughts on American imperialism and the war on terror, which many of us from the global south see it as another manifestation of America's racism towards the rest of the world, and mostly the global south. And we also found it difficult to reconcile the fact that a black president could continue with this policy and drop bombs in, I think last count it was about 7 countries, which are all based in the global south, and kill so many black and brown bodies. So I would like to understand, how do you kind of take that sort of a racism, which is kind of more obviously impacts not America, but countries that I belong to?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy, actually. I don't mean pretty easy in a good kind of way. It's pretty easy. The same way a black president could be head of a country and watch as black people in that country still suffer under some of the very same racist strictures that would have impeded his wife and his children. Barack Obama is a symbol, and his greatest power is probably in his symbolism as a black president. The reasons why bombs are being dropped across the world and why America makes war across the world is systematic. It's part of the very idea of what America is. Oftentimes, there was this whole debate, not before Barack Obama was elected, but certainly afterwards, about what the value of a black president was. And I always thought that what we had to do was think a little bit about what kind of black person could be president of the United States. Before, when we didn't actually think it was possible, it was this sort of abstraction, like you would see it in comedy and films, because nobody actually believed it could actually happen. But there are limits to what America actually is. There are things that America does that are, deeply, deeply troubling for people like us. When we read about, for instance, when I read about, drones circling above and terrifying children, and I think back to being a kid and how, I was, living in a relatively, high crime area, and the helicopters would circle above. And we knew, that meant that the cops were coming, and what cops did in black neighborhoods and the similarities between those things. The absence of legal process for who can be killed and who can't be killed. When you, see that sort of thing, and then you look in your communities and see the police doing the exact same thing, to black people in those communities. A black person who wants to be president of the United States has to actually be okay with exercising that kind of power. That's the deeply tragic part of it. The questions of American power go much deeper than actually, what your personal identity is. Barack Obama is still an American. And worse still, or maybe not worse still, I guess this is just a fact, black people are Americans. Black people are, in fact, arguably the oldest Americans, or next to the oldest Americans, next to the Native Americans. We were there before there actually was an America, and black people, by and large, believe in America, sometimes to our very detriment. I think one of the exciting things about me being here, one of the things I'm looking forward, to doing over the next few years, I spend a lot of time writing about black people in America and trying to, understand black people in America, which is a job in and of itself, but exploring those connections, for black people here, for instance, how you guys even define black here, which is very, very interesting, and how people of color, are defined across the world, and what those connections are, and how we can, work together beyond these strictures of nation. It's a very tragic thing to have a black president continuing the same policies, as a white president. At the same time, I can't say I was completely surprised by that.
Let's go over to the other side for a question.
Thank you so much. I'm studying to be a primary teacher, so I'm very conscious of the power that I will have in a classroom as an educator, but also as a white person. And I'm very interested in being an ally, co-conspirator, choose your word. But I'm wondering, how do I teach about Australian history and particularly looking at things like the stolen generations, and balance that against the fact that it's still current policy. We're still taking children on a massive scale in Australia. And so how do I teach about those issues and be a truth teller and empower my students to ask questions of these structures and challenge those structural inequalities while balancing it against issues of trauma in a classroom where I might have children who are in out-of-home care because it's still current policy?
I guess.
I'm the chair of a current New South Wales government inquiry into Aboriginal child removals and out-of-home care. So I'm kind of limited in what I can say about that, except to say one of the things that we obviously find in our work, looking at a cohort of about 1,152 child removals over a one-year period, is a very clear connection between those children and young people and the history of removals of their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. So that you referred to, I think, intergenerational trauma, which I think is a really important issue that needs to be spoken about. A significant part of that is having Australians, including caseworkers, understand what the Aboriginal history of child removals, or the Aboriginal history of just reserves admissions, the Aboriginal history of compulsory racial segregation, why the compulsory racial segregation happened, the stories of the massacres and the killings. Like you can go all the way back. Being a history teacher, of course, is really critical then to being able to convey to those young people that much of what you see today, such as child removal policies, is influenced by those policies of the past. The problem I find in Australia is people do not believe that link. There's also that attitude that, oh, well, come on, can't they just build a bridge and get over it? There's also the important, I think, matter of being able to distinguish the removals during that protection era from the removals of today. It's done in a very different way and sometimes for different reasons, and it's important to be kind of nuanced and layered and textured about that. But I mean, I don't think they're inconsistent in terms of being able to teach your students about that or any other element of Aboriginal history. One of the things that I find today is that there's just so much information available. If you look at some of the histories of the frontier wars now, I look at Stephen Gapp's book, who I've been reading, the Sydney Wars. Like, they're really excellent historians in this country who are bringing out a lot of really important stories about just how terrible, just how serious the massacres were. They were almost, as Noel Pearson argues, a very mundane part of Australian life. The entire country's wealth is built upon the killing of these people and the decimation of these people and the removal of them from the land and the dispossession of their land. What's important in teaching that, of course, is that we are still yet to deal with that. We have not reckoned with that at all as a country. But it starts with the classrooms. So the expert panel in 2011, we did say to the Minister, maybe you don't do a constitutional recognition process. What we're hearing from white Australia and Aboriginal Australia is that Aboriginal history is not taught enough. We were in Longreach and pastoralists were saying all we know is the Anzac stories. We actually don't know our history, even let alone Aboriginal history. And that's not a very glamorous thing to go back to a minister and say, dump the process for 10 years and just have a really intensive 10 years of really excellent Australian history programs in primary schools and high schools. But it came up again in the referendum council as well. So one of the things I would say is there's a very beautiful, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is about 18 pages. The top page is the one that was read out, but in it is an agreed story of all the First Nations from across Australia. It's called Our Story, and it maps the phases of history, of Aboriginal history. It starts with invasion, goes to the frontier killings, goes to compulsory racial segregation, it goes right through to now. And it's a really, I think, every single region contributed, but I think it's a story issued by Aboriginal people at Uluru last year, and we're really keen for Australians to read it and see what the history looks like through our eyes.
Okay. One question over here. Yeah.
Hi.
Okay. A quick question so we can get through to the next people. Okay.
Okay. You mentioned before about settlers coming to various lands and saying, oh, the land is empty. And it made me think that part of the reason they did that and were able to tell them, believe it in themselves, is that they thought if the people were not white, they were less than people. And that kind of thinking, I think, still persists today. And I was wondering if you could talk about that attitude and how it is subtly or not so subtly used to control, like in America with the immigrants and people of color.
I just want to interject. I'd really like to get the question from the person after you as well, so let's have a short answer, and then we can get the next person. Thank you.
All I can say is, I think that is absolutely it. That's right. The civilizing mission of the white people who came to the empty/not empty land. And I think that's the sort of one of the enduring myths about whiteness. And we see it in Australian politics all the time, this notion of Judeo-Christian values, attempts to set up, units and universities that are about teaching Western theory and philosophy. I mean, these are dog whistle, right? And what they're whistling at is this notion that Black people, that people of color don't have cultures that have any value, and that's because we're not civilized. It is what it is. It continues to be what it always has been.
Next
and,
question.
sorry, and I'll just add to that. There's two really good books in Australia that contest, that myth, which is very entrenched here, despite the High Court's decision in Mabo, and despite their kind of muddled, conquered, settled distinction. And that is Bill Gamage's book and Bruce Pascoe's book, which are really fabulous Australian histories about who was here when the invaders arrived.
Thank you. Next question.
So just a quick one for Sisonke. It's around the future for South Africa. And, when you think about the student movements like Fees Must Fall, calling governments to task, access to education, when you think about how racists are being called to task, you think Adam Katsavela's, whatever his surname is. So do you feel positive that, Black people are standing their ground, that things are moving in the right direction, or do you just think it's empty?
I think it's not about positive or negative, because acts of Black people standing up for ourselves and speaking out, we do that as we look at large institutional structures. So they're not equivalent, right? So it is important that we speak out. So there's a mood in South Africa. There's certainly a sense of confidence, of assertiveness. The quote-unquote born-free generation has come of age. So we're 26 years old as a country, and so those who are 25 and 26 are, have just gone through university. They have challenged the government. They are challenging the narrative of the rainbow nation that, the world loves South Africa because of Nelson Mandela, and they call Nelson Mandela a sellout, right? So there's lots of myth bashing that's happening at the moment, and I think that can only be a good thing, because a country like ours that has been so reliant on heroes, on these revolutionary heroes who have disappointed us. When you rely on heroes, you will rely on individuals, and yet you're dealing with structures. So I think it's really good, the kind of discourse that we're engaging in. I worry that in the South African context, we give too much space. I understand it, but it bothers me. That we give too much space and attention to white people who hurt our feelings. I think the language around racism and hurt feelings is dangerous, because of course people are hurt by racism, but often I'm not hurt by racism. I'm not interested in interpersonal attacks on me. They don't hold power over my sense of myself. I'm totally, if a racist calls me something, that's the racist problem. So I worry a lot about how much we continue to care about what white people think, but I think that's a minor concern in relation to the larger issue, which is that standing up voices is good, but it's insufficient to counter the institutional power that whiteness continues to exert in the South African case. So we really need to deal with the economy.
And over here.
Thanks. This is a question for everybody, please. When you were talking about a myth before, there was kind of a resigned agreement that education wasn't getting it done or wasn't enough to break that down. I wondered if you could talk about what is enough, or where can education sit in a process that actually is effective? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I got a little hope for you. Everybody says I don't have hope. That's the thing, I don't have hope. I don't have too much hope in the politics in America. I actually have increasingly more and more hope. Actually, in the realm of education, And in the realm of pop culture, this is going to sound maybe a little silly, but I think like the movie Black Panther was a really big deal. And I've been like trying to process this, right? When people want to do something to you, when they want to take something from you, human beings always have to justify the taking. So I want to take this land, but there was nobody here. I didn't even really take it. You know, I want to enslave these people. Oh, but I gave you literacy and Christianity. You know, and around these reasons, around these ideas, there's an entire architecture that's erected. And it's propagated through film, it's propagated through, in America, it's propagated through novels, it's propagated, across the culture through statues, of people who actually were enslavers and white supremacists made up to be heroes. And one of the beautiful things that's happening in America is Black people are increasingly seizing power of these sorts of symbols. And this idea of symbolism is often denigrated, but it's the actual symbolism that justifies the taking. Because without the symbolism, you're just a bandit then. You're just a pirate. You don't have your nobility anymore. You're forced to face the question. And so I think increasingly you have a generation of Black people in America who are coming of age in film, who are in fact coming of age, I would argue, in fiction, in journalism, in academia. Actually, some of our histories are much more thorough, which was not the case 100 years ago. I mean, 100 years ago, the histories pretty much reflected the white supremacist myth. So if I have any sort of hope, it's that the war against symbol, I think, is being waged very effectively.
Let's get one more question from this gentleman here in the last minute or so that we have.
Hi, just probably a bit of a personal question, but I'll come in my 50s. I've been in Australia. I was born in America and for 26 years and 28 years here. It's exhausting being a person of color sometimes. I mean, like, I viscerally, I fight the good fight. I'm talking it every day. I think it's amazing, the three of you up here, the fact that you can be doing what you're doing right now, despite everything. But how do you personally get through those moments when you're just like, I can't cope with it anymore? What do you do for your mental health? What do you do to get through it every day and get up and do what you do? Because it's amazing. Thank you.
Okay, I'll answer that. I actually wanted to answer the last question,
okay.
The question about education, so I'll wrap it up together. So in South Africa, we've had this really interesting set of, what the previous question was referring to, which is these statues that have come down. And at the University of Cape Town 2 years ago, this young man went to one of the townships that's located in the Cape Town area and brought a bucket of shit to the university, because it's easy to find a bucket of human shit because of the way our public toilets work, because we are still so poor. Yeah? So he brought a bucket of shit and he threw the shit onto the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. And he began this movement called Rhodes Must Fall. It caused the greatest offense that you can possibly imagine. It was like the country was on fire because the act was seen as so fundamentally provocative that someone would throw shit on Cecil John Rhodes, after whom Rhodesia was named. Like, this is a bad guy. Like, people in his generation, he's not a bad guy looking back at history. In his time recognized him as a mean guy, right? This is a known fact. And the shit on Rhodes statues, sets South Africa on fire. I mean, it has been an amazing few years. So this is what this comment refers to, but it's about the symbolism. It's about this notion that Rhodes must fall. And so the slogan, the hashtag for young people across universities in South Africa was Rhodes must fall, hashtag Rhodes must fall. And what it meant was we must decolonize these institutions, that we have to change the face of South African institutions, which remain, University of Cape Town, Africa's best university, which is a very distinguished university, has 2 Black professors. So this is, right? This is in a 2018 South Africa, right? A Black country. So I think this is absolutely a great point about symbolism and how much it matters. In terms of the last question, I am a middle-class Black woman. I have a very nice life. So I don't find it exhausting to be black at all. There's nothing in my life that is very difficult. My kids and I, we live 300 meters from school. I don't have to travel long distances. I don't wear hijab. I wear a headscarf if I feel like it. So my life, because of my class position, is actually pretty okay. So this is not to deny racism, but it is to say that I'm not troubled by my skin color, myself, that my experience, that I have room to breathe. And that I think it's incumbent upon those of us who have room to breathe to recognize that we are often acting as unelected spokespeople, to sit on places like this, and that if you have the capacity to breathe and think and reflect, then it's important to take that seriously, even as you can't take it too seriously, because there was no black vote that said she will be the one who sits on the stage, right? So you can't take it too seriously, but I think it is important to not overdetermine what it means to be black and living in Australia, because it's not horrendous for me.
Ta-Nehisi, anything to add?
Well, I think one of the, and maybe it's similar to South Africa in this sense. No, I don't find it like personally onerous in the same sort of way. But I think that's largely because in America, again, because the black community is so old there, and because of the particulars of Jim Crow and segregation, there are a set of institutions, almost a country within a country, that allows you to reinforce yourself. So while I was very aware of racism as a child, I didn't have much direct contact with it. I went to school almost entirely, if not entirely, with black people until I was in high school. I went to Howard University, which is a historically black college, and where there basically are no white people. All of my friends derive from that place, and none of them are white. I have 6 brothers and sisters, all of them are black. What I'm trying to sketch for you...
We are a world.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I have, like, a place to go. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have a very, very rich and developed, community. I threw a party with a friend last February, 100 people, all of them black. You know what I mean? Like, I have a place. I don't live in a white world, if that makes any sense. I don't live with them. That's not where I make my home, So, when it gets too stressful, I just go home. I just go home.
Find your home. How about you, Megan?
Well, my team's here, and when we're all exhausted by the work that we've been doing on ConRec, and it's not going to end anytime soon. Look, I've just recently been doing a lot of work up in Far North Queensland with traditional owners, and it's still quite extraordinary to walk into restaurants in Cairns and just every single white person look up and just look at these TOs as if they're, racism is really profoundly terrible in this country. My father, my grandfather, they lived under the protection era. I believe it was the Queensland Protection legislative architecture that South Africa adopted for their own apartheid system. And I look at some of the young Aboriginal lawyers and people in the audience, and it's tiring for them, it's exhausting for them. But the one way I look after myself is to watch rugby league.
We'll wrap it here. Please, a big round of applause for Sisonke Msimang, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Megan Davis.